All right, I wanna go down the Bitcoin, portion here a little bit more. So part of the executive order that we saw come out of the White House was basically an audit of the existing Bitcoin holdings of the United States. And as far as I'm aware, that was supposed to be released, a week or two ago. And I think we've heard pretty much radio silence. So are we worried about the results of that audit? Does that change anything as far as the conversation that we just had? Pines, you want to take us away on this?
Yeah, so one point of clarification, I don't believe, although I have to go back and read, that the order explicitly promised to release the results of the audit. It just said they had to conduct an audit and, essentially report back to the president. And so it's up to the president to decide if he wants to release the results. It's my understanding that audit has been done, but is, may have been done and communicated in the depths of the tariff crisis. So it could just be a piece of paper sitting on a desk underneath lots of other pieces of paper. And so I don't know how much signal there is in the silence, right? There's been a lot going on. But I also separately have heard credible indications that the US government had been selling Bitcoin, uh, you know, leading up to the inauguration. I don't know how much. Obviously, some folks on social media have communicated explicit knowledge that this is happening at scale. I don't know that for a fact, but I know it's a suspicion that Bitcoin sales were occurring. So it would be very important to understand exactly what is the current position of the United States Bitcoin holdings as a baseline to understand, okay, what is the content of the strategic Bitcoin reserve and where does that stack up against other countries, right? Ultimately, if Donald Trump wants to make good on his promise to be a Bitcoin superpower, well, that ultimately comes down to how much Bitcoin you have. And so this is a measure of how much the United States is making good on that rhetorical objective. And it also means that there could be additional pressure, depending on the size of what's in the actual holdings, for additional budget neutral purchases, right? That have been also kind of in development over the past several weeks and are also kind of due to the White House imminently. I don't understand the exact sequence right now, but my understanding is that both Treasury and Commerce have been instructed per the executive order to develop very concrete policy proposals. These are taking the form of 2 to 3 page kind of memo ideas uh, that are meant to essentially lay out, okay, how can we make good on this ambition that Bo Hines has articulated as essentially being quite unbounded in a sense to acquire as much Bitcoin as possible. That's it, fits within that constraint of being budget neutral. So they've articulated things, not just these gold certificates, which in my opinion require legislation because the official price of gold can only be changed with legislation. But there are other means of acquiring Bitcoin in a budget neutral fashion where you're not using either debt issuance or taxpayer funds. That's kind of, in my understanding, kind of the definition, right? And so essentially, these are other revenues the government uh, can leverage or other assets that it can sell in order to acquire Bitcoin, right? So revenues that could be used to acquire additional Bitcoin would be things like, say, tariff revenues or other fees that the government collects that are not tax-based fees, royalties, etc., from oil and gas leases, or outright sales of federal land, physical gold, other digital assets that it holds, spectrum of auction spectrums, as well as potential privatizations of, say, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So there's a whole kit and caboodle of ideas, some somewhat trivial in terms of their impact, some very, very large, right, in the tens of billions of dollars. And so there's a lot of ideas that I think are being put on the table, and then it's a question of, okay, who's got the political um, capital inside the administration to push and execute which of those ideas. And there's an interagency working group that, of course, was established by that executive order that's chaired by Bo that will be making those decisions in the next few weeks and months. And so we are very much focused on that, as well as the legislative side with the Bitcoin Act. And so I think that's where we are in this sort of interesting moment. Obviously, I think the last 2 to 3 weeks of headlines kind of took a lot of the attention. I think a lot of the senior principals, cabinet secretaries had a lot of other things to deal with. So I can imagine there's a lot of Bitcoin related items on the agenda that have been sort of on the back burner, right? And then that just a matter of time before the next meeting is scheduled, where the senior principals will review and approve courses of action to acquire additional Bitcoin. And the last point I'll say on that is it's also my understanding that other countries are now paying very close attention to what the U.S. government is doing. I think they had the same reaction that a lot of the market participants had after the election, and then after the inauguration, and then after the relevant appointments, and then after the executive orders, which was okay, reassessing and sort of rebaselining their priors for how serious is the Trump administration about moving in a pro Bitcoin direction, and how serious are they about actually acquiring Bitcoin. And I think the direction of travel on like a month over 1 month basis, if you had like a weighted average of kind of the median uh, belief around the world, especially among decision makers in national capitals, has only been on a trend line up since then. And those systems, those countries have their own internal bureaucratic inertia and mechanisms of, okay, once we read this signal from the U.S., how do we interpret that signal, and then how does that signal get sort of passed along inside their ministries and national leadership? It's my understanding that that signal is being processed and is now being passed along. And so you have everyone from Hong Kong to the Middle East to the Norwegians to the British to the Singaporeans to the Japanese, all kind of looking at what the U.S. is doing on Bitcoin, and they have to internalize and react. And that's a process that's playing out now. I expect it's taking place in the context of these larger changes, and I think everyone is now starting to stitch together potentially what Bitcoin might mean for the U.S. as it seems to be intent on precipitating pretty strategic shakeup in the global system.
So looking at the specific text of the executive order, sort of from a legal perspective, first, the audit was due 30 days from the original release of the executive order, which was March 6th. So that's already been due, but specifically it's due to the Secretary of the Treasury and the President's Working Group on Digital Assets, the Bo Hines and David Sachs group. It's not necessarily due to the public. I would not be surprised if there were complexities or difficulties in actually doing this audit. There are lots of parts of the government, maybe or maybe not expertise in Bitcoin within each of those groups. And, it might be that there's stranded Bitcoin places, there's issues with classification, there's issues with storage of Bitcoin. And so be very curious to see if this ever becomes public, what it is that they found. But the executive order doesn't call for that. To me, the big legal question right now is, what does the term budget neutral mean? I've heard some folks suggest a sort of very stringent version of budget neutral, which is, it can't touch US dollars because money is fungible. And if you spend dollars on buying Bitcoin, that could have been used elsewhere in the budget. That could have been used to pay down the debt. And so, that would be a very constraining interpretation. And maybe that would get you to something like selling existing cryptocurrencies the United States government has, where there's a trading pair with Bitcoin, so you never reach dollars, but it really narrows what you can do from a budget neutral perspective. I personally think a much more like straightforward reading of it, what it means to be budget neutral, is it can't impact other budget line items. You're not cutting government programs, you're not cutting entitlements, you're not actually cutting off or changing different flows of money from the United States government. Under that interpretation, I think there's a lot more latitude to do things that are budget neutral, right? Also, the executive order says budget neutral and not increasing taxes on Americans, which I think suggests that those are different things. So one budget neutral thing you could do, except for the government has made clear they don't want to do it, is raise a tax to buy Bitcoin. That would be budget neutral because you're not taking away money otherwise allocated in the budget. But tariffs are not something that cost the American taxpayer money. And that's something that Bo Hines has recently suggested we could do to raise money for Bitcoin. Selling assets that are already on the government's balance sheet, right? Selling gold, monetizing other assets like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would be budget neutral in this regard. Using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is meant to be sort of a slush fund or rainy day fund to prop up the long-term value of the dollar and by extension US debt, which is what we were talking about earlier. That would be budget neutral in that regard. So be very interested to see when the papers come out that are due from both the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department. How are they interpreting what it means to be budget neutral? And that'll give us a lot of information that's otherwise, sort of not explicitly stated in the executive order about what latitude we have to look for different assets or different capital flows that could be monetized to purchase Bitcoin in a quote unquote budget neutral way.
And Zach, I don't know if you have the EO up, but one of the other things, more kind of technical minutia, that is very important in the EO is the establishment of an office to manage the SBR, right? And so this is where the bureaucratic devil's in the details of like an office, in the common parlance inside DC is like a formal kind of official bureaucratic entity, like it's a construct at a certain level of hierarchy inside a department or agency. And so an executive order saying we need to create a new office to manage the SBR, like you got to think in terms of the typical DC bureaucrat who's now, okay, how do I implement this? Now I have to like basically add a box on the org chart that says the office of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. And there needs to be people like reassigned from existing positions, GS-15s or whatever, to manage and staff that office, to execute, all these purchases, to develop the memos, to like understand the accounting, to understand the tracking, right? You actually have to have people put into a new thing and charged with a very specific task. And of course, this is happening at the same time that you have Doge going through all these agencies, people taking early retirements, people taking buyouts, people being fired, a lot of instability in just the general federal workforce. And I think the Treasury Department and Commerce Department, of course, not immune from that. Um, and so I just, folks need to kind of understand it's like there's a lot of like tactical and operational details associated with going from a piece of paper side of the White House and like actual Bitcoin being purchased with government assets, right? People have to execute that, and it's government officials that are gonna have to execute that. And I haven't seen any indications publicly as to like where that office is literally going to sit, like what level of person is going to be put in charge of it, where it's going to sit inside the bureaucracy, how it's going to staff up, how formal it's going to be, whether it's going to be a formal thing or not, right? So I think the way that bureaucracy could sort of try to undermine this, right, would be to kind of sort of make a sort of a fake office, right? Like it's a fictitious office. It just sort of, yeah, we put it on the org chart, but it doesn't actually have anyone in it. And the sort of, it becomes a collateral duty of some, collection of senior advisors or whatever. But it doesn't get staffed up, et cetera, right? And it requires like top down level, forcing function to see, no, this is a serious, national priority. We need to dedicate resources and personnel to it. And, that's going to take time to stand up. Like people don't just like, okay, like most folks in the Treasury Department have an existing job, right? And this new thing was just created. So who's going to like leave their current job to do this new job? They're going to take it on as a second collateral duty, right? These are like very like practical things that have to be worked through, and those don't take like a matter of days or weeks. Those take months, right? And so that's just my expectation, is that you have kind of this my observation is just there are two different sort of speeds, right? There's the White House, which is moving at tech speed, as David Sachs has said, right? Flurries of executive orders, move fast, right? Like execute. And then you have the existing inertia of the federal bureaucracy, which has procedures and memos and people doing existing things. And if you want to change this, like anything that has large mass, right, has large inertia. It's resistant to change just by its nature, right? And so there's an inherent kind of difference between the speed that the White House wants to go and the speed that the federal bureaucracy almost can go. And I think we're seeing that play out with the Bitcoin policy moves.